The Island of the Dolls, or La Isla de las Muñecas, is unlike any place on Earth, hidden deep within the ancient canal system of Xochimilco, just south of Mexico City. It feels suspended between worlds, part floating garden, part graveyard, part shrine to madness. The story begins in the 1950s with one man, Don Julian Santana Barrera, a quiet, deeply religious farmer who left behind the chaos of city life to live in isolation on this remote island. What began as an attempt at solitude turned into one of the most haunting tales of grief and obsession ever recorded. According to the story passed down through locals, Don Julian discovered the lifeless body of a young girl who had drowned in the murky waters near his island. The tragedy shattered him. He could not save her, and that failure seemed to take root in his mind like a parasite. Soon after, he claimed to have found a doll floating in the same canal, perhaps belonging to the dead girl. Out of respect, or perhaps guilt, he retrieved it and hung it on a tree, believing it would help appease the child's restless spirit. It was an act of compassion, but also the beginning of an obsession that would consume the rest of his life. The first doll was just the start. In his grief-stricken state, Don Julian began collecting more dolls, hundreds of them. He salvaged broken, discarded dolls from trash piles, markets, and canals. Each one was hung from trees, nailed to posts, or strung up on wires across the island. Over the years, the dolls multiplied until they covered nearly every surface. Their cracked faces and missing limbs gave the island a nightmarish quality, as if hundreds of eyes were watching from the shadows. The dolls decayed over time, their plastic skin darkened by the sun, their hair tangled by the wind, and their once innocent faces became twisted masks of horror. But to Don Julian, they were not grotesque, they were sacred. He believed the dolls carried spiritual energy, vessels that could house the souls of the dead. Each doll, in his mind, represented a spirit in need of peace, a way to protect himself and honor the drowned girl whose presence he felt around him constantly. Some visitors later recalled that he spoke of hearing her voice, whispering to him at night, asking for company. He believed she wanted more dolls to keep her from being lonely, and so he gave her what she asked for, turning his home into a shrine of sorrow and fear. The island soon transformed into a reflection of his Minda, place of devotion built on tragedy. The trees, once lush and green, became the skeletons from which hundreds of dolls dangled like offerings. Their glass eyes caught the sunlight, their arms reached out, and their broken mouths seemed frozen mid-scream. Yet to Don Julian, the island was not frightening. It was his sanctuary, a place where he believed he could coexist with the spirits that haunted him. In the eyes of the few people who knew him, however, Don Julian's behavior became increasingly strange. Locals who paddled through the canals would sometimes see him talking to the dolls, whispering as though he were carrying on a conversation with invisible children. Others claimed they heard him singing lullabies late into the night, his voice echoing across the dark waters. The line between faith and madness blurred, and the island became a physical manifestation of his fragile mind. Don Julian lived like this for decades, cut off from the outside world, sustained by the belief that he was doing something meaningful, protecting his home from vengeful spirits and honoring the dead. Visitors occasionally brought him more dolls as offerings, and he would hang them alongside his own, further expanding the strange forest of plastic limbs and porcelain faces. To him, each doll was a soul at rest, but to outsiders, the sight was deeply unsettling. The air around the island felt heavy, almost suffocating, filled with the eerie stillness of forgotten prayers. It's easy to dismiss Don Julian's actions as madness, but there's a deeper sadness beneath it. Grief has a way of reshaping reality, bending logic until the irrational begins to make sense. For him, the drowned girl became a symbol of everything he had lost: his peace, his sanity, perhaps even his faith. By building this grotesque memorial, he gave his pain a form he could see, touch, and control. Hanging a doll was like hanging a memory, one more attempt to make peace with what haunted him. Imagine standing there as the sun sets, surrounded by hundreds of dolls swaying in the breeze. The canal water laps quietly at the edge, and the distant sounds of birds fade into the dark. The dolls' glass eyes seem to glint with life as shadows stretch across the island. It's not difficult to understand how people began to believe that the island was alive, that the dolls themselves carried some essence of the spirits Don Julian spoke to. In the stillness, you might even feel it, the strange mix of reverence and dread that defines the place. By the time Don Julian's story began spreading beyond Xochimilco, the island had already become something of a legend. Tourists, journalists, and curious locals came to see the macabre creation of the Hermit of the Dolls. But for Don Julian, it was never about spectacle. The island wasn't meant to frighten. It was meant to soothe. It was his offering, his way of giving back something to a world that had taken so much from him. Yet, in his attempt to find peace, he built something that reflected his torment more clearly than his devotion, a garden of grief that had become a living nightmare. The Island of the Dolls is not merely a story about ghosts or superstition, it's a story about how human beings cope with loss. It's about the desperate need to make sense of tragedy, even when logic fails. Don Julian's actions might seem extreme, but at their core, they come from the same place as every shrine, every candle lit in memory of someone lost. The difference is that his memorial never ended. It grew and grew, just like his sorrow, until both became inseparable from the land itself. Today, the island still stands, preserved almost exactly as Don Julian left it, a decaying, haunting labyrinth of dolls, slowly being reclaimed by nature. Each year, the faces become more distorted, the limbs more brittle, but the story behind them only grows stronger. The line between love, guilt, and madness blurs there, and the silence carries the weight of a man's lifelong grief. If you want to explore more true stories that uncover the haunting side of human emotion and the places it creates, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze, where we reveal the darker truths that linger beneath history's most mysterious legends. Don Julian Santana Barrera lived alone in the tangled beauty of the Xochimilco canals, surrounded by slow-moving water and whispering reeds. For him, the quiet was once peaceful, a retreat from a busy world, but after the day he found the drowned girl, that peace shattered forever. The sight of her small, lifeless body haunted him. Every ripple in the canal reminded him of her final struggle, and every whisper of wind through the trees sounded like her voice calling from beneath the water. He could not escape it. It followed him into his sleep, into his prayers, into every corner of his lonely island. Then one day, something strange appeared. Floating gently in the canal, tangled in weeds and drifting toward the shore, was a small doll. Its painted face was smudged with mud, its dress torn and soaked through. To anyone else, it would have been a piece of trash, just another forgotten toy carried by the current. But to Don Julian, it was a sign. He believed it belonged to the girl, a remnant of her brief life, proof that her spirit still lingered near the water. He picked it up carefully, wiped away the dirt, and stared into its empty eyes. In that moment, the line between faith and fear blurred. Don Julian was a deeply spiritual man. He grew up in a culture where the living and the dead were never entirely separate. The canals of Xochimilco, with their slow, murky waters and ancient floating gardens, were already considered sacred by many. To him, the doll was not just an object, it was a message. He felt that the girl's soul had attached itself to it, reaching out for comfort. So, in an act of respect and protection, he tied a piece of cord around its neck and hung it from a tree near the spot where he had found her body. It was meant as an offering, a gesture of peace for the lost spirit. That first hanging doll changed everything. From that day on, Don Julian said he felt something different in the air. He described feeling watched not with malice, but with sadness. The wind carried whispers. The creak of the wooden dock at night sounded like soft footsteps. He started talking to the doll, asking the girl for forgiveness, promising her that he would care for her spirit. It was as if the act of hanging that doll had opened a door he could never close again. For many people, grief is quiet. It lives inside the mind, surfacing in moments of silence or regret. But for Don Julian, grief became something visible, something he could touch. Hanging the doll on the tree gave him a sense of control, a way to express the guilt that consumed him. He couldn't save the girl, but he could protect her memory. And as days turned into weeks and weeks into months, he began to notice more dolls floating through the canal's arms, missing eyes gone, torsos scorched by the sun. To him, these weren't random bits of trash. They were messages, perhaps gifts, from the spirit world. Each time he found one, he would hang it somewhere on the island. He started believing the girl's spirit wanted company. He imagined her lonely, wandering the island at night, surrounded by darkness and silence. To keep her from being alone, he gave her more dolls each, one a new friend, a new protector. Soon, the trees around his hut were covered with them. They dangled from branches, nailed to posts, tied to poles, and even hung inside his small shack. Over time, the island began to change. What had once been green and serene became a place of strange beauty. Landscape of eyes and limbs and faded smiles swaying in the breeze. Locals began to notice the transformation. Fishermen and traders traveling through the canals would pause when they passed by, staring at the hundreds of dolls hanging from the trees. Some thought it was witchcraft. Others whispered that Don Julian had gone mad. A few, though, felt a strange reverence for what he was doing. They saw it as an act of devotion, a man's desperate attempt to make peace with the unseen. And perhaps in their own way, they understood him. But for Don Julian, the dolls were not decorations or art. They were prayers. Each one had meaning. He didn't care if they were broken, missing limbs, or burned by the sun. He said that imperfection didn't matter because the spirits inside them were whole. Sometimes he would find a head without a body or a body without a head, and he'd still hang it up, saying that every piece of a doll carried its own soul. He believed that even fragments could protect the island from evil. Over time, Don Julian's life began to revolve entirely around the dolls. He stopped thinking of them as objects. They became his companions, his audience, his family. Visitors who came to see him often said that he spoke to them as if they could hear him. He gave them names, cleaned their faces, and replaced their missing limbs when he could. He wasn't collecting them for beauty, he was maintaining them like relics. People started bringing him dolls as gifts, believing they were helping him keep the island's spirits at peace. They'd arrive by boat, hand him old toys, and watch as he hung them among the others. Soon, the island became a living museum of grief, each doll carrying a story, each one representing an emotion too painful to describe in words. What's most haunting about this part of the story isn't the image of the dolls themselves, but what they represent. Don Julian was trying to fill an emotional void with physical things. He was trying to make sense of something senseless. Hanging dolls became his ritual, his prayer, his way of speaking to a world that had stopped listening. In psychological terms, this is called a displacement, channeling pain into something tangible so it feels manageable. But to Don Julian, it was much more than that. It was faith. At night, when the moonlight hit the water, the dolls would sway and creak softly in the wind. The sound was eerie, almost like whispering. Locals who passed by claimed they heard the dolls moving even when the air was still. Some said their eyes seemed to follow boats as they drifted past. Whether these were real phenomena or tricks of the imagination, didn't matter. The island had become a place of legend. The dolls, weathered and broken, now carried the collective fear and fascination of everyone who saw them. Even as rumors spread about his sanity, Don Julian didn't stop. He believed he was doing what was right. He often said the island was blessed, that the dolls protected him from evil forces. To him, every decaying toy was another barrier against the darkness, another offering to keep the girl's spirit at peace. But as the years passed, what began as a single act of compassion slowly turned into an all-consuming obsession. There's something profoundly human in that transformation. When people lose something or someone they can't replace, they often find themselves trapped in cycles of ritual lighting the same candle, visiting the same grave, saying the same prayer. For Don Julian, his ritual became the act of hanging dolls. It gave his grief a rhythm, something to hold on to, and yet it also deepened his isolation. The more dolls he hung, the less he spoke to people, and the more he devoted himself to the spirits he believed surrounded him. By the time the island was completely covered, there was hardly a single space untouched by a doll. They hung from trees, floated in the water, lay in piles on the ground. Their faces stared in every direction, some smiling, others cracked or melted. In daylight, they were eerie curiosities. At night, they became something else entirely, a silent army of eyes, watching the man who had given his life to them. Don Julian's obsession began with compassion, but grief doesn't stay gentle. It twists, changes, and consumes. What started as one doll for one lost child grew into an entire world of dolls, a physical representation of sorrow, guilt, and faith tangled together. The island became an echo of his mind, cluttered, haunted, and forever searching for peace. This was the beginning of the legend of the Island of the Dolls. The act of hanging that first doll marked the start of a lifelong descent into obsession, a desperate attempt to turn pain into meaning and loss into devotion. For nearly half a century, Don Julian Santana Barrera transformed the small, quiet island in the Xochimilco canals into something no one had ever seen before. What began as a small act of More Niña, single doll hung to honor a drowned girl, slowly grew into an immense, haunting landscape of decay and devotion. Over time, every tree, every pole, and every wall became part of this strange, living art of sorrow. The island, once lush and peaceful, was now alive with thousands of dolls in various stages of ruin. Their faces cracked, their eyes clouded, and their limbs twisted by time and weather. Each morning, Don Julian would wake before sunrise and begin his routine. He'd paddle along the narrow canals, scavenging for dolls that floated in the water or had been left behind by visitors. He visited markets, trading fruits or vegetables for old toys that others considered useless. To him, every doll, no matter how damaged, had value. A missing arm didn't matter. A broken face didn't matter. What mattered was the spirit that might live within it. The more disfigured the doll, the more powerful he believed it was. He didn't clean or repair them. He didn't dress them in new clothes. He hung them exactly as he found them, believing that their decay gave them authenticity. Over the years, the dolls became part of the island itself, some nailed to trees, some tied with wire or string, some hanging upside down, spinning slowly in the breeze. As the seasons passed, the once bright colors of their dresses faded. Mold crept across their faces. Their plastic limbs cracked in the sun, and insects built nests inside their hollow torsos. It was as if the island was absorbing them, turning them into something half human and half landscape. Visitors who came to the island often said that it felt alive, not just because of the dolls, but because of the sound. When the wind blew through the trees, it carried a chorus of creaks, clicks, and whispers. Some swore they heard soft crying, like the sound of a child far away. During the rainy season, the dolls' hollow heads would fill with water, and as the air shifted, that water would drip in rhythm, echoing through the island like slow tears. It was a place that seemed to breathe an ecosystem of decay, grief, and imagination intertwined. There were thousands of dolls, each one placed with purpose. Some were arranged in groups, as if gathered for conversation. Others hung in isolation, their bodies twisting gently over the water. Don Julian called them his children, and he said each one protected him. He believed they kept away evil spirits, and that the drowned girl's soul guided his hand whenever he added a new one. Sometimes he would hang a doll at the edge of the water, saying it marked a place where a spirit passed through. Other times he would build small altars using fragments of dolls' heads without eyes, torsos without limbs, surrounded by candles and offerings of fruit. The longer he lived there, the less distinction there seemed to be between Don Julian and the island. He became part of its story, and it became part of him. His small hut was filled with dolls hanging from the ceiling, perched on shelves, nailed to the walls. When people visited, they described walking into a space where hundreds of eyes stared from every direction. Even the bed where he slept was surrounded by them. He said they comforted him, but to outsiders, it looked like madness. Still, word of the island spread. Some came out of curiosity, others out of fear. Travelers and locals alike would hire boats to visit what they began calling La Isla de las Muñecas, Island of the Dolls. When they arrived, the sight was overwhelming. Dolls of all shapes and sizes hung from branches. Baby dolls, porcelain dolls, plastic toys from the 1950s, all rotting together in the sun. Some were missing heads. Others had hair made of moss or cobwebs. Many were covered in dirt, insects crawling across their faces. Yet beneath the horror, there was a strange sadness, as if each one had a story too painful to tell. Some visitors tried to talk to Don Julian, but he was often quiet, preferring to listen to the sounds of the island. When he did speak, he talked about the spirits as if they were old friends. He said the dolls were happy when more people came, that the girl's soul was no longer lonely. Many visitors brought their own dolls as offerings, leaving them behind in trees or on the dock. In doing so, they unknowingly continued his ritual, helping the island grow even more crowded. Over the years, the dolls began to rot together, merging into the environment. Roots wrapped around their bodies, branches pierced through their chests and skulls. Some were half buried in the soil, their faces peeking through the ground. Sunlight filtered through the trees and cast eerie shadows that made the dolls appear to move when they didn't. The island became a place of constant illusion. Nothing stayed still, nothing stayed silent. The air around the island carried a damp, earthy smell of decay. It wasn't just from the dolls, but from the surrounding swamp, the algae, and the slow movement of the water. Everything there seemed ancient, trapped in a state between life and death. The dolls themselves, though lifeless, created the impression of a restless presence. Their blank stares reflected in the canal's dark surface, giving the illusion that something was watching from beneath the water. Some said the dolls' eyes glowed faintly at night. Others swore they heard laughter echoing from the trees when no one was there. Local fishermen avoided the island after sunset, claiming they saw shadows moving among the dolls or heard whispering voices calling their names. Whether these stories were real or imagined, didn't matter. The island had become a mirror for human fear. What people saw there depended on what they carried inside themselves. For Don Julian, though, this strange, haunted place was home. He didn't see the dolls as grotesque. He saw beauty in their imperfection. To him, every cracked face and missing eye told a story of endurance, of a spirit that refused to leave. When he walked among them, brushing the dust from their cheeks or untangling their strings, he moved with care, as though tending to living things. He believed the dolls were alive not in a physical sense, but spiritually. They were vessels of energy, each holding a fragment of the girl's sorrow and his own redemption. Sometimes he would sit on the edge of the island, surrounded by the dolls, and play music on a small radio. The sound carried over the water, echoing through the canals. In those moments, it was said that the dolls seemed to move slightly in rhythm, swaying as if listening. To the few who witnessed it, the sight was both mesmerizing and deeply unsettling. Man, surrounded by thousands of decaying faces, serenading his own ghosts. The dolls became Don Julian's language. Through them, he communicated with the unseen, with the past, with his own guilt. Each one was a word in a story he could never stop telling, and as time went on, that story grew more intense. The island began to resemble a surreal dream, a place where art, madness, and mourning blurred into one. There's a strange beauty in what he created. To an outsider, it's horrifying, a landscape of rotting toys staring from the tree's butt. Beneath that horror lies something profoundly human. The island isn't just a monument to fear, it's a portrait of grief made visible. Every doll is a confession, every crack a scar. Over 50 years, Don Julian turned the island into a physical diary of his emotions. Each doll, a sentence written in plastic and decay. The longer he lived there, the less the island felt like part of the world. It became its own reality, a place where time didn't move normally. The dolls aged, but Don Julian stayed the same, trapped in his ritual, repeating it day after day. And in that endless repetition, the line between man and myth began to fade. To those who visited, he was no longer just a caretaker. He was part of the island itself, its guardian, its creator, and perhaps its prisoner. The island of the dolls had become more than a shrine. It was alive in the minds of those who saw it, a terrifying, living landscape that defied explanation, a place where grief and imagination intertwined, and where the silence between the trees carried the echo of one man's lifelong conversation with the dead. By the year 2001, Don Julian Santana Barrera had spent half a century living among the dolls. Surrounded by the silent company he had created for himself, the island had become his entire world, a realm built on faith, fear, and loneliness. To him, every hanging doll was a companion, a protector, or a spirit whispering softly through the rustling trees. But to the few who still visited, it was clear that he had grown increasingly detached from the world beyond the canals. His conversations revolved around the spirits, the girl, and the unseen forces that ruled the island. His obsession had long since crossed the threshold between devotion and delusion. Those who knew him said that in his final years, Don Julian seemed to live in a strange rhythm of peace and paranoia. There were days when he would laugh and talk to the dolls as if they were old friends, offering them food, brushing off the dirt that clung to their cracked faces. On other days, he would become withdrawn, whispering to himself about the presence of spirits that never left. He spoke of the drowned girl more frequently, insisting she still lingered near the canal, watching over him or perhaps waiting. He told his nephew that she had begun calling to him again, her voice carried by the wind that moved gently across the water at night. To outsiders, these words were the ramblings of an old man who had spent too long in isolation. But to Don Julian, they were warnings. He believed that the spirits were growing restless once more, that his offerings of dolls were no longer enough. He said that the canal, the same dark water that had delivered the girl to him all those years ago, was alive, hungry, and patient. It was as if he knew something was coming. On the morning of his death, the day began like any other. The air was heavy with humidity, the kind that clings to your skin and carries the smell of wet earth. Don Julian had breakfast with his nephew, Anastasio, who had come to help tend to the island. They drank coffee together near the dock, surrounded by hundreds of staring dolls, their faded faces watching in silence. According to Anastasio, his uncle seemed calm that morning, even content. He talked about expanding a small shrine and adding new dolls that had washed up nearby. Later that afternoon, Don Julian told his nephew he was going to the canal to fish. It was something he had done countless times before, and there was nothing unusual about it. But when Anastasio returned a few hours later, the boat was empty and Don Julian was gone. His body was later found floating in the water, in the same spot where he had discovered the drowned girl decades earlier. The circle was complete. The news of his death spread quickly through the nearby villages. To the locals, it was not a coincidence. They believed the spirits had finally claimed him, that the girl he had spent his life trying to appease had reached out and taken him into the same dark waters that began his obsession. Some said he had always belonged to the island, and in death he simply returned to it. Visitors who came afterward said the island felt different. It was quieter, heavier, as if the dolls themselves mourned. The air carried a stronger sense of dread, and the stillness of the canal seemed unnatural. The boatmen who ferried tourists across the water began to tell stories about seeing ripples appear when no wind blew, or hearing splashes at night when the water should have been calm. They said that if you looked closely at the canal's surface, sometimes you could see two reflections where there should be one of yourself and one watching from below. Some of Don Julian's friends believed that his death was peaceful, that he had finally joined the spirit he had devoted his life to protecting. But others whispered darker theories. They said the dolls, now countless in number, had trapped his spirit among them. According to local folklore, the island's energy changed after his passing. Some claimed the dolls' eyes began to follow visitors more noticeably, their heads subtly turning when no one was near. A few even said they heard the faint sound of laughter or soft weeping coming from the trees after dusk. Anastasio took over caretaking duties after his uncle's death, determined to preserve the island as it was, but even he admitted that the atmosphere was no longer the same. He said it often felt as though his uncle never left that sometimes. He could hear footsteps in the dirt paths behind him or sense someone watching from the shadows. When asked about the day his uncle died, he would only say that Don Julian had seemed at peace, as if he had finally accepted something he could not avoid. The canal itself became part of the legend. Locals began referring to it as cursed, a place where the boundary between the living and the dead was thin. Fishermen avoided casting nets near it. Tour guides refused to pass it after dark. And yet, despite the fear, the story of Don Julian drew more and more people to the island. The visitors came for many reasons: curiosity, thrill, or reverence. Some brought dolls of their own, hanging them in the trees as offerings to Don Julian's spirit or to the girl S. Others came seeking proof of the supernatural, trying to capture strange movements or eerie sounds with their cameras. Almost all left uneasy. One tourist described feeling a hand brush her shoulder while she stood alone near the dock. Another said his boat began drifting backward against the current as he approached the canal where Don Julian had drowned. To the locals, these stories are simply proof that the island's guardian never left. They believe that Don Julian's soul still walks among the dolls, tending to them as he did in life. Some say his spirit now protects the island, ensuring that the offerings continue. Others believe he remains trapped, unable to move on because of the very obsession that consumed him. Either way, his presence is deeply woven into the atmosphere felt in the rustling trees, the creaking wood, and the faint smell of the swamp that hangs in the air. Even today, visitors who come to the Island of the Dolls describe a sense of being watched from every direction. The dolls, with their cracked faces and glassy eyes, seem to observe each movement. It's a sensation that grows stronger near the canal where Don Julian died. Some claim that if you stand there long enough, you can hear the faint sound of water lapping against the shore, followed by a whisper that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. What makes his death so haunting is not only the coincidence of location, but the eerie poetry in it. The same canal that began his life's mission was where it ended. The same water that carried the drowned girl to him took him to. It's as if the island demanded balances if the debt he spent 50 years trying to pay could only be settled with his own life. To those who knew his story, Don Julian's drowning wasn't an ending, but a transformation. The man who built a shrine to grief became part of the shrine itself. His death gave the legend permanence. Without him, the dolls might have been forgotten, their story lost to time. But with his final act, whether intentional or not, he ensured that the island would live forever in the imaginations of those who hear of it. Even now, when the night falls over Xochimilco and the canals go still, locals say the island awakens. The dolls creak as they sway in the dark, their eyes glinting in the moonlight. Somewhere among them, the spirit of Don Julian is said to move silently, still watching over his sorrowful sanctuary. His lonely death became part of the myth he created, a tragic end to a lifetime of obsession. Whether you believe he was claimed by the spirits or simply by fate, his story remains one of the strangest and most haunting in modern folklore. The Island of the Dolls stands as both his grave and his creation, a place where grief took form and where one man's devotion to the dead became eternal. Today, the Island of the Dolls is no longer a quiet corner of Mexico's. Canasit has become one of the most unsettling and iconic places in the country. What began as one man's desperate attempt to calm a spirit has transformed into a place that both fascinates and terrifies thousands of people every year. Tourists from all over the world now travel deep into the Xochimilco canals to witness the eerie vision that Don Julian Santana Barrera left behind. An island covered in weathered dolls hanging from trees, fences, and posts, each one staring down with cracked eyes and missing limbs. For many, it feels less like a tourist destination and more like a living nightmare, a place where grief, death, and devotion still breathes through every shadow. The journey to the island itself sets the tone. Visitors board colorful wooden boats, called trajineras, that glide slowly through the calm waters of The air feels heavy, filled with the scent of wet earth and the hum of insects that thrive among the reeds. The canals twist and turn through thick vegetation. And as the boat drifts closer to the island, an uneasy silence replaces the usual music and laughter that fill the area. The first thing people see is the sight of dozens, then hundreds of dolls hanging motionless in the humid air. Their hair is tangled, their faces are faded, and their eyes stare blankly from every direction. Some hang by the neck, others are nailed to trees or impaled on sticks. Time has not been kind to them. Many are missing limbs or heads, their plastic bodies eaten away by decades of rain, mud, and sun. Locals often warn new visitors not to mock or touch the dolls. They say each one carries energy, some good, some restless. The belief that spirits inhabit these dolls is not just superstition. It's a continuation of Don Julian's own faith. People still bring dolls as offerings, tying them to branches or hanging them near the small wooden huts he built. Each new doll adds to the collection, forming layers of history upon the island, as if the spirits themselves are growing in number. Over the years, visitors have left not only toys, but also coins, candles, and notes asking for protection or forgiveness. Some even whisper prayers to the drowned girl, hoping she will keep them safe on the water. The atmosphere on the island changes with the weather. During daylight, it feels eerie but calm, almost peaceful in its stillness. Sunlight filters through the trees, casting shadows over hundreds of decaying faces that seem to follow your every move. But when night falls, the mood turns heavy. The wind rustles through the leaves, the dolls creak on their ropes, and the water laps softly against the shore. Tour guides often refuse to stay after dark, claiming the island becomes alive. They tell stories of dolls moving their heads, of eyes blinking, or faint whispers carried through the mist. Skeptics dismiss it as imagination or the sound of nature, but even the bravest visitors admit that the energy there feels different, as if something unseen watches closely from behind the trees. What makes the Island of the Dolls so powerful is not only the disturbing visuals, but the story behind it. Don Julian's devotion has turned into legend, a man who spent 50 years trying to protect the soul of a little girl he never knew. His story has become a reflection of deep Mexican traditions surrounding death and the supernatural. In Mexican culture, the dead are not forgotten. They remain part of daily life, honored and remembered through stories, shrines, and offerings. The island captures that belief in its purest, darkest form. It is a shrine built out of fear and compassion, where the line between devotion and madness vanished long ago. Cultural historians often describe the island as a mirror of Mexico's relationship with death. The Day of the Dead, for example, celebrates departed souls with joy and remembrance, not terror. But the Island of the Dolls takes that same reverence and twists it into something tragic. It is not a place of peace or celebration. It is a place of mourning and isolation, born from one man's inability to let go of his guilt. Every doll hanging from a tree is a piece of that emotion, frozen in time, a visual diary of a man who tried to speak with the dead and may have joined them in the end. Today, the island is protected as part of Xochimilco's UNESCO World Heritage Site, but it remains raw and untouched. There are no paved paths, no fences, and no official signs. The sense of authenticity adds to the unease. Nothing about it feels staged or artificial. It looks exactly as it did when Don Julian was alive, preserved by time and the swampy conditions. Visitors describe it as stepping into another world, a forgotten place where modern life feels far away. Some compare it to a horror movie set, but the difference is that everything here is real. The dolls were not placed for entertainment. They were placed as offerings, each with purpose and history. Television crews, journalists, and paranormal investigators have visited the island for decades, adding to its myth. Many claim to have captured unexplained sounds or movements on film. Some believe they've recorded voices whispering from the water. Others dismiss these stories as tricks of the mind, caused by the echoing canals and the unsettling sight of hundreds of faces watching from the trees. Still, the reports keep coming. Every few years, a new team visits and the legend grows stronger. Local boatmen often serve as storytellers for tourists. They recount Don Julian's life with reverence, mixing fact with folklore. Some say he was chosen by the spirits. Others say he was cursed. One of the most popular tales claims that, on quiet nights, the spirit of Don Julian still rows his boat through the canals, his lantern glowing faintly in the fog. They say if you hear the sound of oars splashing softly after midnight, you must look away, because if he sees you, he might mistake you for one of the restless souls that still call to him from the water. For locals, the island is both a source of pride and fear. It represents the endurance of Mexican folklore stories that are not written in books, but lived through generations. Children grow up hearing about the man who talked to dolls and the girl who never left the canal. Some families even avoid traveling near the area at night, believing the island's energy can bring misfortune to those who disrespect it. Yet, for others, it's a sacred place. They see Don Julian as a guardian, not a madman, a man who sacrificed his sanity to maintain balance between the world of the living and the dead. Every doll hanging from the branches now carries a story of its own. Some were placed there by travelers seeking forgiveness, others by parents remembering lost children. There are dolls dressed as angels, soldiers, brides, and even animals. Over time, rain and mud have distorted their features, creating grotesque but strangely human expressions. As sunlight fades through the trees, their shadows stretch across the island, turning the place into a strange theater of memories, a silent performance of sorrow, devotion, and fear. The story of the Island of the Dolls endures because it touches something deeply human. The fear of being alone with your guilt and the longing to connect with something beyond death. Don Julian's Island is not just a horror storiette, it's a reflection of love taken to its most extreme form. It's a story about how far a person will go to make peace with the past, even if it means living in darkness. That's why, decades after his death, the island still speaks to those who visit. It reminds them that obsession and faith can sometimes look the same, and that grief has a way of haunting the places we leave behind. So when travelers make their way through the misty canals and see those dolls swaying in the wind, they aren't just witnessing a local legend. They are walking into a piece of Mexico's sola living folktale that whispers through the trees and into the hearts of everyone who dares to listen. The Island of the Dolls stands as a chilling monument to one man's grief and the powerful connection between life and death. And as long as the dolls remain hanging, so will the story of Don Julian Santana Barrera, the man who tried to save a spirit and became one himself. If you enjoyed this haunting journey through one of Mexico's darkest legends, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to Belmoze for more stories that uncover the chilling truths behind the world's most mysterious places.